So today we're gonna talk about my favorite books of all time. This was a really hard list for me to come up with. I haven't included any books or really anything that I've read in the last year because I don't feel like I have enough perspective on those books yet to really decide if they are my all-time favorites. So anything on this list is probably going to be from at least a year and a half ago. You'll find I read pretty broadly across genres. And like with my favorite books from 2017, I haven't really cut it down to a particular number or anything. I just went through my Goodreads and I just picked the books that have stood out to me that I still remember even after reading a while ago. So let's get on with it. Here are my favorite books. I feel like this first one is gonna make me look so pretentious. It's a Shakespeare play, actually. It's Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. I first read this for English class when I was 14, and I read this again when I was about 20 for an English literature class when I was an undergrad. It's basically about these twins. One's a girl and one's a boy, and they get separated in a shipwreck, and one ends up in this country and one washes ashore in this other country. And so the girl, her name is Viola, she disguises herself as a boy and serves in the Duke's court in order to survive. She's sent by the Duke to talk up this lady that he's really interested in, and this lady ends up getting really interested in her instead. And then lots of comedy and what have you ensues. This play has always really appealed to me above all others. So funny and it's so poetic. Personally, I love the relationships in this play. I love the dialogue. It's just an amazing play. Next on my list is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. I was prompted to read this book after I saw the West End adaptation. So the novel's by Mark Haddon, and it's about a boy called Christopher who is autistic. He has trouble understanding facial expressions and everyday human interactions. He loves mystery novels and he really wants to do physics and one day go to space. And one day his neighbor's dog is found murdered and he decides to investigate because he really loves detective stories and he really wants to be engaged in a mystery himself. And so this whole incident leads to him discovering a lot more about his family and relationship dynamics, and also the shades of gray and moral ambiguities that reside within each human being. I mean, the writing was amazing. You could really understand what was going on around Christopher, even though he didn't really. It was this amazing read. It was sweet, and it was sad, and also happy at some parts. I'm not really sure what the next book really belongs in genre-wise. It's Hyperbole and a Half by Ali Brosh. So Ali Brosh used to run this webcomic called Hyperbole and a Half. She would sort of illustrate events from her life. She would be drawn as this really crude figure with a yellow triangle for a ponytail. She would describe really funny incidents from her childhood, but then she would talk about her battles with depression. And at one point she compiled all of these comics into a book called Hyperbole and a Half. And it's so poignant about her mental health struggles. And even if her pieces are sad, she's also so funny. I love how her humor is so incisive, but also so insightful. Also, her computer art is just amazing. It sort of looks like a kid drew it, but in this really deliberate way. I wanted to cop out on this next one and just say, oh, well, anything by David Sedaris. I mean, every book by David Sedaris is amazing, right? Because I love David Sedaris. He writes the funniest essays ever. I actually got to see him read last year. I drove an hour to see him, and he signed my book. If I were pressed to pick a favorite, I'd probably pick Naked. So the centerpiece of that essay collection was a piece about his experience in a nudist colony. He went there to kind of experiment with his own mindset about his body image. He talked about how over time, when he sort of got over the whole being naked in front of other people and seeing other people's bodies, he started to just see people for who they were rather than how they looked on the outside. That's such an amazing piece. He's such a comedian, but he's also so thoughtful and so profound. A close second for me is Me Talk Pretty One Day. And now for something totally different. My next book is Watchmen by Alan Moore. So if you don't know, Watchmen is about an alternate history of the United States. The US won the Vietnam War because of a super being called Dr. Manhattan. Masked vigilantes were a big source of law and order. It's 1985 and Richard Nixon is still the president. But someone has started to kill off these masked vigilantes, and that sparks a big whodunit mystery. Also, you get familiar with the backgrounds of these different characters. Alan Moore just writes these amazing, rich stories. They're always so messed up, but in the best way possible. He talks a lot about the decline of civilization, about how different human beings achieve enlightenment, and also a lot about human relationships as well. He also does these amazing characters, and he has a particular way of pairing different kinds of characters next to each other. So if you like Watchmen, and you haven't been watching Comic Book Girl 19's Watchmen book club, you need to do so now. So Comic Book Girl 19 has been doing this series called Watchmen book club. She did something like this for Dune last year. Basically every week she's going through 1 or 2 issues of Watchmen and analyzing them. I think I've read this about 2 or 3 times. The first time when I was 18, the second when I was like 20 or 21. But I feel the strong urge to reread this series now as an adult, just with our current political climate. It's so applicable. The artwork is so pristine, the layout is just so deliberate. So I love Watchmen. If you read any graphic novel, you must read Watchmen. My next book is also a graphic novel. It's more of a graphic novel series. It's the Sandman series by Neil Gaiman. I especially love the first volume, Preludes and Nocturnes. So from what I understand, when Neil Gaiman was working for DC Comics, they threw him this miscellaneous comic book character called the Sandman, and they were like, oh, well, you know, do whatever you want with it. And so then he took this character and just made it his own. So the Sandman is one of the Endless. The Endless are these set of siblings who control different elements of the universe. There's death, there's destiny, and despair, and desire. So Sandman is Dream, so he controls Dream. Preludes and Nocturnes really covers his capture by a bunch of really overly ambitious human beings. And when he finally escapes, he has to deal with all the instability that has occurred ever since he was captured. It's surreal in only the way that a Neil Gaiman piece of writing could be surreal. I think I have about 3 volumes left in the Sandman series. I mean, I love the whole series, but definitely Preludes and Nocturnes is still my favorite volume. Next up is White Teeth by Zadie Smith. I really love every novel that I've read by Zadie Smith, but White Teeth is still my favorite. So White Teeth was Zadie Smith's first novel, which she published when she was 24. Life is Not Fair. It's basically about this Muslim family. They're friends with this kind of older, middle-aged English guy and his really young Jamaican wife. The novel also talks about the lives of their children and how they deal with different racial dynamics. This Muslim family, they have 2 sons, and one they send to India because he's super studious and they want him to be the model son who follows their religion. The other son is just sort of a rebel, but he ends up becoming like an Islamic extremist. This English guy and his wife, they have this biracial daughter who sort of doesn't really know how to cope with her racial identity. She struggles a lot with her body image and how it doesn't really fit into conventional beauty norms in the West. It's such a funny book, but it's so thoughtful about racial dynamics and about familial expectations. A lot of Zadie Smith's work touches on similar themes. On Beauty covers a lot of these themes, even though it's set more in an academic setting. And of course, Zadie Smith's work has grown and matured over time, but she's always been so good and so funny and so snappy with her words. If I wanted to emulate any literary fiction writer, it would be Zadie Smith. So next up, of course, I had to include 1 or 2 Jane Austen novels on here, or maybe 3. I love Pride and Prejudice. Of course, Pride and Prejudice belongs on this list. You know Pride and Prejudice, right? Of course it belongs on this list. It's just a great story. Now, close behind it, and also on this list, are 2 other Jane Austen novels. The first is Sense and Sensibility and Persuasion, which I actually have here with me. So Sense and Sensibility also has a strong sister relationship in it. It's considered that book that you read when you want to deal with a breakup. I know I've reread it a few times when I was dealing with breakups. It's made into this amazing movie with Hugh Grant and Alan Rickman and Emma Thompson, but it was also made into this amazing mini-series with Dan Stevens in it. Just a really great novel about different ways of dealing emotionally with really hard relationship stuff. Persuasion, I don't think people pay enough attention to. It's considered one of her more mature novels. I think this was actually published posthumously. So if you don't know, Persuasion is about this girl who turned down her fiance when she was younger because he didn't have enough money yet. And so later on, she's unmarried, she's 27, and her ex-fiance comes back and he's made his fortune and he's super rich, and so she wants him back, but she doesn't really know if she can because he seems to be flirting with like a couple other girls. But I really love this book. And Elliot, she has this humor hiding inside this really understated character. Next up, of course, I have to include the Harry Potter series. How can I not include the Harry Potter series? It was my first introduction into fantasy, definitely a huge influence on my reading life as a young reader. I'm constantly amazed at how well the series has aged. I also reread the entirety of this series on audiobook a couple years ago. I always pick up on more. I'm always finding everything funnier. I'm always picking up on details that I didn't notice before. I always have such a deeper appreciation of J.K. Rowling's plotting technique every time I read it. Yeah, Harry Potter, of course it's on this list. Some of you may have guessed this based on my reading tastes, but the Game of Thrones series is also on this list. Like many people, I got into this because of the show. Also, I was hugely influenced by Comic Book Girl 19. A lot of her big videos are about Game of Thrones history and background lore. She made me appreciate the world building behind Game of Thrones so much. There are some amazing fantasy elements in this novel, but like really I love the world building history. I grew up with Tolkien, and I have an appreciation of building up historical figures and landmarks, engineering believable history. Everything feels really real, so detailed and intricate. My favorite of this series is probably Feast for Crows. A lot of people don't like Feast for Crows. They think it's really boring, but I personally love Feast for Crows. It's the one book that Daenerys is not in because it's supposed to take place concurrently with Dance with Dragons. A lot of it covers Cersei's grab for power in this power vacuum left behind by Joffrey. Oh, spoilers. I love how just as she's coming up and like she's at the top, and you feel like she's at the top and she feels like she can't possibly come down, and she comes down so hard. How that was done was incredible. It was such an incredible book. Next up is The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. I have an interesting history with this book. So when I was 9, my mom sat me down and showed me the film adaptation of The Joy Luck Club. It's got that gal from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. in it. So I watched the movie and I was really interested in it. I was really interested in connecting with my culture. So I went into my mom's basement library and I found it and I read it. And honestly, even as a 9-year-old, I didn't have much trouble getting through it. I found the writing itself really easy to get through at the time. But of course, as a 9-year-old, I also didn't pick up on a lot of the subtext. And then later on, as a freshman in high school, we got it as a reading assignment. And then I read it again and I was like, oh, that's what I was missing when I was 9. Also, I rewatched the movie when I was a senior in high school and I was like, why was I allowed to watch this movie when I was 9? It's about this group of 4 Chinese mothers who came to the States from China, most of them post-World War II. They settled down with their families and they each had a daughter. A lot of the novel deals with the mothers' histories back in China and how they deal with that baggage in the present when watching their own daughters grow up in this new society. And also there are chapters that cover the daughters and how they deal with culture clashing in their own lives. It's one of those novels where, yeah, you have to keep all the characters straight. It's still one of my favorite books. I would definitely reread it given the chance. There's definitely been a lot of controversy about Amy Tan's stereotyping of mainland Chinese people. She is herself a Chinese American who grew up in the States. And maybe that's why, because I'm a Chinese American, I didn't really take much issue with it. I still definitely recommend this book to anyone who's interested in immigrant narratives and stories about immigrant culture dynamics. Next up is Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. So I was 16, I had read all the Twilight books that were out. So I was personally a little bit disappointed with where the Twilight books had taken the vampires. I mean, the romance, okay, like, you know, I was in high school and I was okay with that. But I wanted the vampire narrative to go somewhere exciting. So I started looking into other vampire classics, you know, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and of course, Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. Anne Rice has always had this really rich writing style. This book is so good. It's about this vampire called Louis, and he's turned into a vampire one day by this vampire called Lestat. They sort of form their own family unit. They also convert this child vampire called Claudia. So the present of this novel is centuries after this event, and he's talking to this guy and like being interviewed about his experience. I mean, his voice is kind of whiny and sad, but in the most poetic way possible. But also through his eyes, you get to see the vampire Lestat, who is the most colorful character ever. Like, I don't know why more vampire characters can't be like Lestat. And I love the novel that comes after this book, The Vampire Lestat, and Queen of the Damned was pretty good too. But overall, Interview with the Vampire was probably my favorite. The books after Queen of the Damned have been, you know, they're okay, they're entertaining. The last one I read was Prince Lestat, which took me a year to read because I had the most horrible time getting through it. There's way too many characters I didn't care about at that point, and there was just no plot structure whatsoever, and nothing exciting was happening, and everyone was just whining about their own predicament. So I don't really recommend the later ones, but definitely the first 3. If you're into vampire stories, you have to read the first 3 Vampire Chronicles. Last but not least, of course, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. You must have thought I forgot about it. You probably guessed that that series is on my list. Probably the biggest influence on my reading life. It's the metric by which I have measured all other high fantasy. I can't really say enough good things about Tolkien. He's my linguistic hero. He's one of my greatest literary heroes. He pretty much changed world building as we know it in the fantasy world. And a lot of people have pointed out how he sort of put some racial coding in his stories. Like, you know, he has really dark-skinned humans working for Sauron. I was watching a Lindsay Ellis video about Tolkien, and she does note that, you know, Tolkien, he wasn't a racist, he was just a product of his time. He did grow up in imperialist England, surrounded by imperialist rhetoric. Also, critical racial theory wasn't really a thing. So you know what? I can live with those things. And you know, the books aren't perfect by any means. Some structural weirdnesses in the story might not be acceptable today, but he's got some amazing characters. It's still such an important story. I have read so much fantasy since, but of course, to me, there is only one Lord of the Rings trilogy. So those are my favorite books of all time. I have no doubt this list may change over time. Tell me some of your favorite books of all time. In the meantime, you can follow me on Twitter and Goodreads, and I will see you in my next video.